Hey guys, back with another video, and this time we're going to cover curve guides. Curve guides is one of those things that I have written extensively about, but at the beginning it was really hard to understand and really difficult to get a kind of result that made any sense. So I've even revised the article on my blog post with information as I learned more stuff. So let's get into Blender and we'll take a look at what we can do with curve guides. Now to help with this scene, I've set up a very basic scene, and I've set up a very basic hairstyle, and I'm going to start by explaining how curve guides work. Now for the demonstration, I have reduced the number of children to 4 because if I were to increase this any further than that, it slows down the update and I try to do any changes to the curve guide, and that can make the process a bit annoying. Okay, so let's first create let's just first name our collections real quick. Okay, and I'll just double check if we have any field weights. No, great. Okay, so the first step obviously to control a curve guide is to add a curve, because a curve becomes the curve guide. So there are a couple of curves you can use. You can use the Bezier curve, or you can use the path. This is a nub spot, I believe. I'm going to use a nub spot because it's a lot easier to control in the beginning. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'm going to snap the cursor to that single point. I'm going to right click, set origin to 3D cursor, then I'm going to snap the cursor back to the origin, and then snap the object's origin to the cursor, and then that's how I moved the point here, making it a lot easier for me to control. Then I'm going to move this up a little bit, rotate it 180 degrees, and then move it outward this way. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm just gonna hide the hair groom so that I can see this properly, because what I want is I want the curve to be positioned something like this. Okay, cool. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm also gonna shrink this down quite a bit and then apply all transforms. Well, not all transforms, apply scale. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to enable proportional editing, and I'm gonna kind of move this into place like this, something like this. Okay, just get a interesting shape like this. Okay, and it kind of looks like a single long hair strand kind of thing. And let's just enable our hair grooms again one more time, and just position this a little bit better, something like this, somewhat in the hair itself, because I want it to be like that. And I'm also going to rotate it slightly this way. Okay, there we go. And that's our curve guide. Let's also rename this and call it a curve guide, just so that we can recognize it more easily. And let's move it to a new collection, and we'll call this effectors. Okay, just to stay organized. Okay, and we have here effectors. Great. Now as you can see, nothing is happening, and in order to see something happening, you need to actually convert this curve into a curve guide, and you do this through the forces, because somewhat related to what we discussed in my last video, which is hair dynamics, curve guides are actually a type of force that controls hair or particles. And the way we can do that, use it, is by taking a curve and converting it into a force field. And you can do that by clicking on the curve, in this case the curve guide, going to the physics properties, and then enabling force field. As soon as you do that, it's going to be a regular force. That's not what we want. We want to convert this from the type of force to type of curve guide. And as soon as we do that, you can see an immediate crazy change to our hair. Okay, our hair completely alters itself. Let's disable it and reset this. and you can see this is what a hairstyle looks like now. And as soon as I make this a curve guide, boom, what happened? So what happened was all of the hairs in the entire hair groom is now moving, or rather following the shape of the curve guide. Okay, that's what a curve guide does. It forces all the hair to follow the shape of the curve guide. Now this is immediately sounding very useful, but also completely useless if every single hair strand in the entire hair groom is going to follow it. But there is a lot of settings here that we can use to control this. Before that, let me just show you a little bit about the behavior. Now if I was to move or edit the hair, the curve, we'll start to see some changes in the shape of the hair groom. Okay, so I just wanted to show this as well, show this to you as well, and we'll come back to this, but for now let's look at some of the other settings. Okay, the first setting we have here is the minimum distance. And the minimum distance is a setting that is primarily useless for hair, because it's a setting that affects particles. Remember that this is a force field. Curve guides are a type of force field that affects both hair and particles. And if you're going to affect particles, this is very useful. But right now for hair, it doesn't have any effect. Whether I set this to 0 or set this to whatever number, it has no effect whatsoever. So we don't really care about that. Okay. The next setting is free. Free is, if I were to increase this, you can immediately see complete chaos. Okay. And you can also see that it's clamped between 0 and 0.99. What exactly is free? Free is another setting that is primarily useful for particles, because particles, generally speaking, have a life. And if there is a particle that, say for example, is supposed to live for 100 frames, okay, free will determine what percentage of the particle's life is the particle going to follow the curve guide. For example, if we have an animation that is 1,000 frames and our particle only lives for 100 frames, and we set this to 0.5, what's going to happen is the particle is going to follow this curve guide for half its life, and then after that it's going to be free to do whatever you want. The remaining other half is going to be outside of the curve guide. So in other words, by changing this, you can change the speed at which it moves through the curve guide. But the problem with that, using this for hair, is that hair doesn't really have a life. So once it reaches the end, it just goes haywire. So we don't want this setting at all. Okay, so you want to keep this at 0. The next setting is Falloff power. Now Falloff power, unlike the previous two settings, actually has some usefulness for hair guides, and I'll come back to this in a bit. But when we increase the Falloff power, basically what we're doing is we're creating a fall off between the different hair guides if we have more than one, or we're creating a fall off between the original state and the single hair guide. So as you can see, at fall off of 10 there is pretty much 100% fall off, and as we increase it, there's a sort of fall off between 100% affected by the hair groom versus the further away it's going to be less affected. It's still affected, as you can see, but it's less affected. Okay, so that's what the fall off does. Okay, now I'm going to do something crazy. I'm gonna set this fall off to 0 for a moment. I'm also going to go into the top view, and I'm going to go into X-ray mode, or even wireframe. No, X-ray mode is better. Okay, so I can, or even better, I'm just gonna turn off the hair for a second. Okay, let's hide it. Okay, and I'm gonna duplicate the hair guide. I'm gonna put a different hair guide on the other side, and this one I'm just gonna slightly shape differently. Okay, so it just looks a little different. Then I'm gonna unhide the hairs once more, Okay, and as you can see now, what is happening? Well, the hair is now trying to follow this hair as well as this guide, and it's sort of combining the effect, you know, and it's trying to follow both together. And that's what's happening here. Okay, if I were to move this one around, you'll see that it still affects the hair groom. Okay, cool. So what do we do about this? Well, the fall off actually here helps a lot. If we were to now increase the fall off, you'll notice you're actually increasing the fall off between this version and the combined version. If I were to increase the fall off of this one, the second hair guide, it'll try to move towards the other one. And if I were to increase the fall off of both, it will go back to its original state. Okay, so the fall off can be useful if you're trying to use multiple hair grooms and you want a sort of interpolation between all of them. So in this case, if I was using 1, 2, 3, I don't know, like several hair grooms along the side of the head, and I wanted the hairs to follow each hair groom and fall off between them properly, this is a setting that could do this, but it would be a very, very tedious way of controlling the hair grooms. Okay, so let's turn that off. Oh wait, let's undo that. I want to bring that back for a second. Okay, the other setting just below fall off is something called Additive. Okay, and it's a checkbox that changes the way the fall off calculation works. If I were to click Additive here, you can see the fall off looks a little different. Okay, now if I were to turn it off completely, Additive has no impact whatsoever. It's only when there is a fall off that Additive has an impact. Okay, so if I were to put this at 0.1 or something, or just 1, and put this at 1, and you can see that we're changing how the fall off applies. So if you just see the tooltip, it says how quickly strength, no sorry, based on the distance fall off, it adds a portion of the entire part. It's a little confusing, but just know that it just changes the calculation, okay, of how the fall off is applied. No fall off, Additive becomes useless. Okay, the next setting is weights. Okay, but I'm gonna come back to weights in a moment. No, let's do it right now. Okay, the way weights work, if I were to enable this, okay, you'll see that nothing is happening, and that's because weight actually depends on a setting inside the curve. So if we go to the edit mode, okay, of this curve, and we select this point, the very last one, and I press N on the keyboard to get the N panel, which is this panel, and under item transform, you can see there's a couple of options: weight, radius, and tilt. Okay, the weight is basically a setting that says, okay, and it basically says that the hair must follow this curve, and the weight is a determinant saying that 100% attraction force at this point. Now if I were to reduce this, you'll see something weird is happening. Okay, and let's reduce this as well. Okay, if I were to disable weights, all of those weight effects don't apply. If I were to enable it, it applies. Okay, and what's happening is basically the weight is when there's no weight on this point, the hair is following up to this point and then trying to go back to its original position, which is problematic. Okay, so let's set this back to 1, and let this set this back to 1 as well. Was this, yeah, let's set this back to 1 as well. Okay, a much more realistic approach is to start the weight, is to reduce the weight from the top Okay, and let's do that for this as well. Okay, remember there is a minimum value. Okay, you can't set it to 0. And what's happening here is that because the weight is really low, it's screwing up. Let's delete this second one. I think that's disrupting the calculation slightly. Okay, there we go. So now, because the weight here is at 0, let's set this back to 1 to see what's happening. So the weight is 100% following this, but if I were to set this to 0, the weight at this point is 0, but the weight here is at 1. So at this point, the hair is just moving in the way that it originally was. If you look at the fall off 0, you can see that it's kind of maintaining its original structure, but then after that it's following the curve. So if we reduce this, you can see that it's really not following the curve from here and here, but then after that it's following the curve, and you can create some interesting effects like this. Okay, obviously not with this setup, but with the right setup you can create some interesting effects. And I believe even if you were to increase the weight too much, 1 is the max. So you can technically drag your mouse, but 1 is the absolute max. So if I were to reduce this, I can further reduce this effect. Okay, let's set all of this back to 1. So this is a pretty interesting effect. Okay, cool. So let's get out of edit mode. Okay, and that's what weight does. Now I'm just going to disable this for now, and we'll keep that disabled as well. Now the next setting is the clump amount. Now clump is something that we already know about. We've seen in some of my previous videos and also the beginning of my article. It's a very common setting that allows us to create clumping. Now you can see that it's a 0 to 1 value, and as soon as I enable it to 1, you can see that the hairs try to clump together, but this time specifically affecting the curve guide. So it's clumping for the curve guide. Now we can even go to -1 and it'll be clumping in the opposite direction. Okay, but or rather it will like anti-clump, as it were, you know. And I try to spread out a little bit more. Okay, but we can set this to 1, and then we have the clump shape. It just says shape here, but it's really clump shape, and as you already know, this controls the shape of the clump, whether you want it to you know, clump more on this side or this side, you know, and you can control that. And 0 is the default. Okay, that has a shape like this, large here, small here, and then you can just move that position along the curve guide like this. Okay, and that's the clumping setting. Okay, so let's set something like this and something like this, and we've got a clump. Next we have the use max setting, and this is one of the more useful settings. So if I were to click this, you can immediately see that it just went back to normal. And this is because right now this is basically showing the maximum distance that's this setting will work. So at the moment it's 0. If I were to increase this, you can see a small little circle, dotted line circle, and that's the distance that the curve guide will operate on. Okay, and the wider I increase it, the more it affects, and the smaller I decrease it, the less it's going to affect. So right now it's only affecting this whole section, but anything outside of this circle, this dotted circle, is unaffected, and that's what max distance is. And that's very useful because this way we can use a curve guide with a big hair groom like this without having to affect everything in the hair groom. And there we go. Okay, now the final setting Now the final setting that we're going to look at is Kink. Now Kink is very similar to the Kink that we already know. There's nothing too different about it, but at first it can be a little confusing. So let's take Kink and set it to curl, for example. And as soon as we set it to curl, there's nothing happening, and it has an axis, a frequency, a shape, and an amplitude. So let's increase this amplitude slightly, 0.1, and you can immediately see there is an effect. Okay, if I were to decrease it to 0, there is no effect. If I hold on, go back to curl. Or let's do braid. I think braid will be more visible. Okay, and we increase the amplitude 0.1, and nothing is happening. Okay, why is that? That's because we need to increase this frequency. Okay, as we increase the frequency, you can immediately start to see something bad happening. It's supposed to braid, but I think it's too many hairs for this to properly calculate, even if we use the max setting. Okay, so I'll show you how to do this a different way. Okay, so the Kink, usually you're gonna find weird problems like this with the Kink, right? So let's not explore this way. I'll show you a different way to handle this. But if you do find problems with this kind of thing, it's probably because you have too many hairs and the calculations are too much. So I'll show you a different way to handle this effectively. Okay, what we're gonna do is I have one last thing I want to show you, and let's just increase this just a bit. Okay, and also I'm going to move this out so that we can properly separate it and see it better. Okay, as you can see, it's already taking quite a bit of time to process. Okay, a few things you should know is that no matter how far away you pull this curve guide, it will always the hair will always lengthen to follow it. Okay, so one of the things I want to show you, a very cool thing, when you go to the edit mode of the hairs, we already noted how we can control the weight, but there's another setting, another two settings called radius and tilt. Okay, and we can control this differently as well. So the radius in this particular case can be adjusted by increasing it, and this will basically increase the radius of the hair groom in that particular area. So we can even do that over here, for example. Okay, if I was to increase it this way, and maybe I want to decrease this one. Okay, can decrease it that way and increase this one. Okay, so there is a possibility of doing that. Now if I were to set all of it to 1, okay, and if I was to decrease this radius, you'll see this happening. But if I was to increase it beyond 1, you might start to see some unexpected behavior, especially from the center. Okay, so there's some effect like that. So let's just increase the clumping amount, and that'll sort of allow us to further decrease this, I think. Okay, there we go. Maybe you don't want this to be too thick, so you can reduce the radius of this and get a thinner strand. Now another interesting feature is the tilt, and the tilt will allow you to sort of roll this hair. Okay, now we can let's keep the radius as it was, and let's tilt this, and you can immediately start to see, as I roll it, the hair is starting to rotate around itself. Okay, so if I was to say, for example, rotate this 180 degrees, and I'll rotate this 360 degrees, and I'll rotate this 360 plus 180, whatever that number is, 540. Yeah, okay. you can start to see that the hair is starting to rotate along this line. Okay, and that's what tilt does. It allows you to rotate the hairs. Okay, and you can go pretty crazy with this, so you got to be a little careful with this value. So this is another powerful feature that allows you to control how the hair is supposed to look. So if you wanted to adjust specific clumps or strands, you can rotate them, increase its size, reduce its size, or reduce the influence of the hair groom. So let's turn this down to 0.5 or even 0. Let's turn weight on. Let's go here and turn this back to 1, and let's just rotate this a little bit, 180, and this one 360. Now we got some interesting effects on our hair grooms. Very cool. Okay, and that's all there is to the settings here, except for the kinks, which we will talk about now. Now when we're using curve guides, one of the things that you'll find is that it is extremely tedious to try to use curve guides to style the whole hair. So you don't want to use curve guides for every single aspect of creating your hair grooms. You want to use the other tools that we already know how to create hair grooms, and curve guides to create just special features, not like this kind of thing or a braid or some kind of effect like that. You don't want to use it for everything. The other thing is you want to make sure that you are keeping it isolated. The other thing is you want to make sure that you're keeping your hair grooms isolated, and the way you do that is by, when you go to your hair groom, you want to add a second particle system, and we'll call this particle system curve guide. Okay, I'm going to call this also curve guide, and I'm just going to set this up as a hair system. I'm also going to reduce its size from 0 to 0.55, just shorten it a bit. It's quite a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a vertex group. I've already created a vertex group called density hair guide, and I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'm going to select just this section. Okay, I'm going to assign that, and that will create a vertex group there, and I'm going to make sure that that vertex group's density, or rather that hair particle system's density, is set to that section. So you can see here it's just like that, and I'm also going to just increase its quality this way, and you can immediately see that now this is an isolated hair system. Now how do we stop the hair curve guide from affecting this hair? Well, the way we do that is by going to this hair, and one way is we can go to the field weights, and we can tell it to not affect curve guides, or not be affected by curve guides entirely, or we can create a new collection. We'll call this effectors hair, and we'll just be affecting the effectors hair here. So now any force that's inside of this collection will affect the main group, whereas any force inside of this collection will be affected by the the curve guides. So this way the rest of the hair is completely unaffected, but the curve guide here is affected, or rather this little clump is affected by the curve guide, and that makes things a little bit easier. And this should ideally make the braid work a little bit better. As you can see, it immediately starts working just a little bit better, because now we're not controlling such a large variety of hair. You can just turn this off as well, because we want it to affect something like this, and we'll just turn this like that. And let's just increase the amplitude. Whoa, too much. 0 0.0, 0.2 maybe. That's too much as well. 0.05. That's a bit too much too. 0.02. Okay, and we have a little bit of a braid effect, and I think we can control it with this. No, let's just go back frequency a little bit. Turn off weights. There we go. Additive, turn it on. I think turn off clumping too. Okay. Okay, part of the reason why you're seeing this look very jaggedy is really because this particular hair groom has not enough resolution. Okay, so you can turn this up and it'll look slightly better, or better yet, when you're doing the rendering, you can turn this up quite a bit, I think to 16 as well, and that should really help. I'm not sure whether we will be able to see it if I set up rendering mode. Let's try. Looks a tad bit better, but the shape is a bit too big. Okay, it's a bit clunky. Not quite. Turn on children. This might work too much. Maybe 5. Enable long hair. Might help improve the quality a bit. Okay, another thing that could affect this could be the length of the curve guide. So sometimes it's a little too compressed. Or if there isn't enough points, let's try to subdivide this slightly and smooth it out. No, I think there's too many points now. Yeah, in this case, I just think we just need to adjust the radius as well. I believe this has an impact. Or maybe I had to do it the other way. Ah, there we go. Okay. Okay. So it's a little slow. Okay, because we're trying to run with a lot of children, and we really increased the strand step quality. Okay, but let's try to edit it now with Okay, so this is something that you might find very irritating with curve guides, okay, which is the fact that when you try to use the kinks, you might get buggy behavior like this. Okay, one way to adjust this is to just adjust these settings over and over. Okay, or you can even adjust the radius like you saw earlier. When we adjusted the radius of these curves, we kind of when I increased it beyond 2, it kind of helps a lot, but sometimes it's still gonna be a little buggy. Okay, and one way you could do this is by just moving the curve guide into position before you decide to enable the effect. Okay, otherwise you'll have bit behavior. So for example, if you see the curl here, we can see the effect quite strongly. If we were to change, I think it to X maybe, or Z, or we could see other effects, whoops, like radial or wave, rotation, not sure, cool, you know, so you can see some different effects, but in this case it's not working as effectively. Okay, but oh, we had a reset, I think. Okay, let it take its second to crash and then reset. Okay, so that's pretty much it there is to know about curve guides. I know the kink didn't kind of work out the way it should, but this requires a lot of experimentation. This is why I was trying to say that it takes a lot of effort to use these kinks, and a lot of patience is required. The best practice that I would tell you is tip number 1: if you can avoid using a curve guide, avoid it, because Blender's curve guide system currently sucks and it's not very good. The new versions of Blender, the ones this is 3.2, but in 3.3 or beyond, I believe Blender is completely revamping the hair system and bringing completely new tools, so that should help a lot. In addition to that, Blender has improved, but it's not yet released, so it's still in beta. But if you can avoid hair guides, completely avoid it. If you have to use curve guides, use it for very, very limited use cases like this, like a certain strand or a certain effect. Don't try to craft your entire hair groom with curve guides. That would be days and days of headaches, and it might not even work out. If you can, try to keep your curve guides on separate systems, so that might require multiple collections and multiple efforts to multiple vertex groups, so that you can keep things separate. It will make editing a lot more difficult, but it can be done. And avoid using curve guides for anything other than special features, you know, like strands and braids and certain effects like this, and then you'll be good. And one last thing, I'm not sure if this is a bug that I faced or it's a bug that other people also face, but if you try to create a curve from a mesh, the curve guide will not work. It has to be created through Shift-A curve. If you try to take a mesh and then you convert that into a curve, it's not gonna work. I don't know why, but it's not. So you gotta be aware of that. Okay, so that's it. That's all you need to know about curve guides. I'll catch you in the next one.